Hello everybody, welcome back to the lecture circuit. Today's topic is how to create habitats for reptiles and amphibians, a framework by PetFacts TV. In my opinion, there are three consistent problems in herpetoculture. First of all, reptile keepers do not have experience with reptiles or amphibians in the field. Second of all, most reptile keepers keep exotic species. And the way I see it, these two problems funnel down to create the final problem, which is that few keepers know how to bend their methods to meet the needs of their animal. In my opinion, you have a context where keepers don't really know what reptiles do out in the middle of nowhere. At any given time, when your bearded dragon is sitting in a cage, there's real bearded dragons that live out in the wild. And as your bearded dragon sits there and lives, those bearded dragons are out there living a real existence. In my opinion, the goal is to create as real of an existence as possible for wild animals in a house. When you keep species that live in places that you've never been to, and you don't really even know anything about the reptiles and amphibians that live around you, I don't know how you're supposed to be able to go to a store and buy things and put together a cage that suits the needs of any reptile. The reptilian superpower is in their ability to interact with different microhabitats to alter their metabolism and adapt to a changing environment. As such, the task of the bioactive keeper is to create microhabitats that cater to your reptile's every need based on their native ecology using the tools that you have at your disposal. In nature, reptiles take care of themselves, and if they're in the right cage, they should be able to do pretty much everything they need to do outside of a few small things to take care of themselves in a cage. An important question that we have to discuss is what even is habitat? Habitat is kind of an abstract idea that a lot of people have spent a lot of time arguing about what habitat is. On its largest scale, everything is habitat. The whole earth is habitat for something. But as you zoom into smaller and smaller scales, you have the opportunity to view habitat on a few different levels. On the landscape level, that's how water and, species and life and rocks and everything on the landscape interact and how the life on that is able to use it. As you zoom in, you can get more and more specific on habitat. That the way that people view habitat through their eyes and through their brain is not the same way that a reptile views habitat through their eyes and their brain. The average human is about 6 feet tall, and that means that their habitat and the scale of their habitat is much, much bigger than a lizard that only gets this big. When you and I walk around in a canyon, we see giant boulders and we see trees and we see grasses. When a lizard lives in that canyon, it sees the small grains of sand and it sees the small rocks and all the burrows and the spaces and the shade between the grass. We see habitat fundamentally different because of the way that our brain and our eyes are constructed. And that's why, in my opinion, the key to keeping reptiles well is to create microhabitats for them so that they can use those based off of what they need. Alright, so now we'll go over a couple of examples here in the snake room of habitat partitioning that I've created. This is a paludarium that I have set up in a 45-gallon tank with a few green anoles in it and a couple of other inhabitants. We'll talk about that on another day. If you look closely, you might be able to see them. Paludarium is the most dynamic version of habitat partitioning that you can make in a tank because there's the constant touching of water and land resources. There's a ton of beneficial bacteria and stuff that grow in water that just don't exist in soil if there's not water in it. And so this adds a ton of dynamism to this tank. There's, mosses, there's magnolia pods, there's cork, there's ghostwood, there's Spanish moss, there's duckweed in the water, there's a little bit of frog bit in there, all sorts of stuff. Cypress mulch, I've got Reptisoil from ZoomEd in there. This tank is just loaded full of resources that are slowly breaking down and making the tank even more bioactive. And not to mention that I have 3 different species and 5 different individuals in this tank. So this tank flourishes. Another point, I have a 10.0 UVB bulb on this, so definitely a lot of UVB in here. Right now you can see on the right hand side that there's a bright white basking bulb, but on the left hand side I also have a blue and a red one. Those turn on early in the morning. It's interesting to be able to move the basking spot around and see how the lizards move throughout the cage throughout the day. So this is definitely the most dramatic example, and it can only get more dramatic as time goes by. I'm going to be doing a few major edits to this tank this spring that will make this even more dynamic and more usable for everybody that's in the tank right now. The second example we're going to look at real quick is here in Grouper's cage. Grouper's a veiled chameleon. You can see there is a dense canopy. I have a money tree in here that is under an Arcadia jungle dawn. It's going absolutely stupid. It's been in there probably 3 or 4 months now, and as you can see, it is just doing crazy. Sprayed it down about 10 minutes ago, and this particular section that's in front of the camera right now, especially when that fogger kicks down, just stays perfectly humid. Never not an opportunity for grouper to be drinking over there, except for when I turn the fogger off during the day to let them dry out a little bit. Another thing about this that is worth pointing out is that I'm running a 10.0 UVB bulb on this, and the reason is because this canopy is so dense that below it there's a microhabitat where even if I run a high output UVB bulb, grouper's still able to go underneath that canopy and get to a microhabitat where he's not stressed by that. Chameleons live in an area where there is plenty of UVB light. They live in a desert. They just live on a mountain range in a desert that stays a little more tropical and a little more temperate, that allows them to hang on. And so in this cage, I have a pretty strong ability to control everything because of this canopy. I can give him tons of water, I can dry it out a little bit, I give him tons of heat, and he can still go underneath that canopy and cool down if he needs to, and give him tons of UVB, and it just creates a ton of gradients in this tank. Really, the big thing to think about with microhabitats is just that you're trying to make gradients of all kinds. In this tank, I have light gradients, I have UVB gradients, I have heat gradients, I have moisture gradients. I have all sorts of things in this tank where grouper can pretty much get whatever he needs. There's rough surfaces, there's smooth surfaces, there's dry places, there's wet places. We're going to go in a little bit of a case study here. These are real photos that I took, and we'll have a look at where I took them, and we'll be real specific about this. There are desert spiny lizards, which are Scoloporus magister, and there are Scoloporus undactylus, or whatever. I don't know which one I'll put it. It might be Consabrinus. There's a lot of Scoloporus. I'm not a lizard guy. All of these lizards were found in the same location in early June of 2021 in a little canyon in southwestern Colorado that my friend Remy and I were visiting. And just by looking at the in situ photos of these lizards in their habitat, we can already begin to think about how we could create a habitat for them. As you can see, we have a number of these lizards sitting in a number of positions on the landscape. Just by looking at the average habitat in each of these areas, which are all pretty close together, we can already put together an idea of how we might set up a habitat for these in our house. There's some considerations that we have to make with the microhabitats that we're building. The first one, heat, sunlight, and shade. As we go through these photos, it's pretty clear it's very sunny here. However, the lizards aren't in the sun for the most part. The microhabitats they're using are shady, they're sticky, they're brushy, they're very dense. So the lizards aren't sticking to open areas where it's super sunny and hot. They live in a sunny area, but they're staying cool by staying in the shade and staying under bushes and in crevices. We're in an arroyo here, so we have dry climbing crevices. We have rugged branches that create shade for the lizards to climb around in, and then occasionally we'll have a rocky area or two. But for the most part, the things that are making up the habitat here are dirt walls and branches. And then a big thing here is that there are almost no water resource anywhere to be found. So if we wanted to recreate this kind of an environment in the house without taking anything out of the environment, here are just a few things that we could use. The bulbs that I've chosen would create a hot, sunny environment in the cage that would supply the kind of shade using cholla wood or mopani wood or cork that the lizards enjoy in the wild. Below that, you could use some Terra Sahara and some leaf litter to create sort of a forest floor kind of effect. The piece de resistance is the excavator sand, which you can really easily use to recreate the kind of arroyo background with the crevices that the lizards could move in and out of to cool themselves down or warm themselves up. Now, this is a short example, and it's definitely it's not complete. This is just an idea of if I was going to the store, this is what I would have in my head as to how we could create this environment for them to where they're living at least fairly similarly the way they would be outside. Here is something that I don't see a lot. I mean, I don't know if other people use this, but I know that a lot of people don't because I look at their setups. iNaturalist. A great application is to learn about the habitat that your reptiles are living in the wild. Let's take bearded dragons, for example, because they're not really hard to keep. We're going to type in Pogona viticeps. Zoom into where they live and find an area where there are a number of observations. Around Alice Springs in Australia is pretty good. And then we're going to go to the grid. First of all, I always like to start out by just looking at the pictures of what the lizards are doing. They're sitting high up in trees, they're sitting under grasses, they're hanging out in the rocks. And already you can see some discrepancies between the way that people are keeping them in captivity in the wild. Next, we can go up and we can get rid of our search for the central bearded dragon and just look at all of the things that are going on in this map area. And just look at all of the habitat in the area. What other animals are there? What kind of trees? What other lizards? What's going on in this ecosystem? Because even if you have a pretty good idea of what bearded dragons look like and what they're doing, it does help to know what the environment around them is doing. Even if bearded dragons live in a place that we tend to think of as super hot and dry, we can already see just looking on here that there's also, wet, moist, wetlandy areas and areas that are quite different from what you would think of as bearded dragon habitat. And like we said, habitat exists on a couple different scales, so by looking at this, we can learn about the habitat on a number of different scales and start to build an idea of how we can build a dynamic cage for these lizards. Also, depending on how much effort you want to put in, this is a great resource for finding some native plants that you can grow on your own or that you can source online that you can put in with bearded dragons or other species so that you can have a planted tank. Finally, we're going to wrap up with just my outlook on the future of great reptile keeping in this area. A huge place for growth for most keepers is to cooperate between field and keeping experts. I think somebody that has exemplified this wonderfully is Bill Strand, who is, in my opinion, he's the only person I'll listen to when it comes to chameleons. Bill has done a number of videos and podcasts with world experts in the field on chameleons, and it's changed the way that he, a world expert in keeping, is looking at his keeping of a number of different species. Most keepers have the opportunity to reach out and talk to field experts that know more about their animal and nature than they ever could imagine. And I think it's a missed opportunity not to be having those conversations. The second, I would say that retailers and manufacturers need to make more affordable and accessible tools for keepers. UVB lights still suck, and it's 2025. And then finally, I think keepers need to learn to work on smaller scales. I think people tend to look at their cage and think, okay, I've got 36 inches by 18 by 18. Cool, that's the unit. And I think that people need to start looking at that the way you might look at nature, where it's like we have a rock, we have a river, we have grass, we have a tree, we have birds, we have a sun, and they move around and they change. This isn't this. You can look at a unit as a small thing within a big thing, and I think that that's somewhere that reptile keepers could grow and start to keep their reptiles better.